had the long run aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply, and the aggregate demand. We covered, we discussed what factors would determine or shift the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply, and what factor would affect the aggregate demand. Then we looked at the difference between the equilibrium in the short run and in the long run, and that's why you need for question 3. So again, in case if you're not in the Facebook group, so you need to study 3 lectures to answer the 3 questions in the assignment. Lecture 2 for question 1, lecture 3 for question 2, lecture 15, which we covered last week, for question 3. And today in my office, even I show some of you who turned up during my office hours that the question you have in the assignment is just an example we used in the lecture last week. So that's why I personally think, I know many of you think they are struggling with question 3, and that's the easiest question in the assignment. Why? Because it's an example we used in the lecture, in lecture 15. So please go back to the recording, and especially, I'm going to post this later on Facebook, but especially in lecture 15 there are 2 parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1, minute 33, tell you the factors that affect aggregate demand. Part 2, the first 15 minutes cover mostly the most of the question. Okay, so please just go and watch the video, and of course if you have any question, you can email me, or if you prefer, post your question on Facebook. Okay, so today we will look at one side. As I said last week, we looked at both sides together, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Today we will focus more on the aggregate demand. We'll look at the components, the main components of the aggregate demand, and we'll see how the aggregate demand in the very short run would determine the level of the real GDP. Do you remember the equation, the main equation for the aggregate demand? Y equals C plus I plus G plus, thank you, plus X minus M. Okay, so that's going to be the main thing today. So that's all our talk today will be around this equation. So keep this in your mind. Just this is the aggregate demand, or these are the components of the aggregate demand, as we said in the previous lecture. We said in the previous lecture that the aggregate demand is the demand that comes from all sectors. And as we know, we divided the economy into 4 sectors. Households, they spend on consumption. So the demand coming from household is C. That's the consumption expenditure. Firms, they spend on investment. And then government, obviously that's G in the equation, government expenditure, and the outside world. So that's sector number 4. So we have 4 sectors in the economy. So the aggregate demand is the demand coming from these sectors together. So what we will look at today is the determinants of this aggregate demand, which basically the components of the aggregate demand, C plus I plus J plus X minus M, and we'll see how the level of the aggregate demand will determine the equilibrium or the real GDP, and that is in the short run or in the very short run. This basically, and we'll learn what it means when one of the components change, how this might affect the real GDP. So let's start with the basic idea. So the basic idea of this lecture is the Keynesian model, which sometimes we call it the aggregate expenditure model. And as you see, this is something related to the very short run when we assume prices are fixed. And if that is the case, then the aggregate demand will determine the real GDP. That's why it is important for us to understand what determines the aggregate demand. So in that case, we need to think of what we said now. So this is the aggregate demand, come from all these sectors. It's just the sum of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. So, and this is the main components of the expenditures or the aggregate expenditure, which represent the aggregate demand. So if we look at this closely, we'll see that two of these components are influenced by the real GDP, and the other three components are not. So basically, I'm talking here about consumption and imports. So we have two components. Remember this because this is very important. We'll see why it is important later on today. But C and M, so consumption and imports, are influenced by the real GDP, and also they affect real GDP. Okay, so that's why we say there's a two-way link between these two. Comes from the fact that the two components here, consumption and imports, are influenced or are affected by the real GDP. So we'll start with the first component, which is C. Remember, C here is the consumption expenditure. Again, we're looking at this because this is the aggregate expenditure. So the expenditures that are coming from the old sectors, because obviously this will determine the level of the aggregate demand. And in the very short run, if prices are fixed, the aggregate demand will determine the real GDP. Okay? So if you want to understand how the GDP fluctuate or change in that time frame, then you need to understand the main components or the determinants of the aggregate demand, if the aggregate demand is important for the real GDP or in determining the level of the real GDP in the very short run. So what we're going to look at now is the first component here, C, consumption expenditure. We would like to understand what determine the consumption expenditure, what determine how much households will spend on consumption. A very important factor or determinant is the disposable income, which is the after-tax income, which is the money left in your pocket after the government collect the tax, after you pay the tax. So that determines your consumption as households. And in that case, then disposable income here is YD, and it equals Y minus T. So Y, this is income or real GDP, minus T. T here is net taxes. So that is the main determinants or the main factor that determine the consumption expenditure. And if we look at how people use their, or how households use their disposable income, so the after-tax income, so they split this between consumption and saving. So see, here's consumption, S for savings. So you either spend your income, or basically you spend part of your income on consumption, and the rest you will keep it or you'll save it. So the disposable income, which is again the after-tax income, so it is Y minus T, is the sum of consumption and or equal consumption plus saving. So that's why we're going to look at now how consumption is determined and how savings are determined by the disposable income, which is the relationship between these two, each one of these two. So the consumption and real disposable income, and saving and disposable income. These two are the consumption function and saving function. So consumption function basically means the relationship between the disposable income and consumption. So this is the relationship between these two, C and YD. Of course, other things remaining the same or nothing else changed. So that is the consumption function. The saving function is the same. So it's the relationship between savings and disposable income. So we want to understand how when disposable income change, when people have more money, left with more money, what they, or disposable income I mean, how this is going to affect their consumption and their savings. So this is a very simple and naive example. If we have 5 or 6 points for disposable income, so we have if income is 0, point A, let's look at the first point. So if income is 0, then for any economy, consumption cannot be 0. Even at the individual level, if you look at like yourself, can you consume nothing even if you have no money in your pocket? It's not something that we would expect, because basically you need to survive. So you need to eat, you need to drink. So it's the same for the whole economy. Consumption cannot be 0. Okay? Even if disposable income is 0, even if the money or the income equal to 0. So in that case, consumption equal 1.5. Just remember, just notice these numbers are trillions of dollars because we're talking about the macroeconomy. Okay? So the consumption expenditure at that point is 1.5. How are we gonna finance this 1.5 trillion dollars? This will come from savings. So that means with your savings, or the savings in this economy in which disposable income equal to 0, then they will use their savings from previous years to finance, okay, to pay for this consumption, even if their income disposable income equal to 0. Then when the income, so you will see this is 1.5, this is minus 1.5. Just remember, this is very simple and naive example, but the main idea is just to explain the relationship between consumption and disposable income, and the relationship between saving and disposable income. And as we said, these are two, the consumption function and the saving function. So when income increased, when disposable income increased from 0 to 2, so we're moving from point A to point B, what we've noticed here is that the consumption expenditure will increase and saving will increase. Meaning there is a positive relationship between both, between consumption and disposable income. So disposable income here increased from 0 to 2, consumption increased from 1.5 to 3. Still, 3 is more than 2. So consumption level is more than the disposable income. Where the difference is going to come from is from savings. So you will see the savings will drop by 1 or minus 1. Okay? So again, because we know that the disposable income should equal C plus S, consumption plus saving. So these two should equal this disposable income. So when income now increase, or disposable income to be more accurate, increase to 4, consumption increased as well to 4.5. So what we can say then, that there is a positive relationship between these two. When disposable income increase, consumption will increase, and that's something something we would expect even without this example. So at the personal level, when your income increase, your consumption increase. That's it, just as simple as that. So for the whole economy, for all households, it's the same way. when their disposable income increase, when the income increase, when their money increase in their pocket, they spend more on consumption, so they consume more. Okay, of course they're not going to consume 100% of the increase in their income, so they're not going to spend everything in consumption, as we'll see now. At some point they start, the savings will be positive. So at point D here, so disposable income was 6, consumption was 6, savings not negative for the first time here, it is 0. But after this point, then they are in a position to make some savings. So they don't need to consume all or to spend all their disposable income on consumption. Okay? So after this point, when at point E, when disposable income becomes 8, then you will see that consumption is 7.5. And that means savings is 0.5. And the sum of these two, 7.5 plus 0.5, that would give us 8. So as we said, disposable income, people use this between consumption and savings. The same for point F. So what is the main message here then? So what is the main idea here? As we said, we're looking at the first component of the aggregate demand. So what are the components of the aggregate demand? Consumption, investment, government, expenditure, and net exports. So we're just looking at C now. We want to understand what determines C, because if we understand that, this will help us understand what determines AD, the aggregate demand. Okay? So in this example now, we can generalize this. Yes, we can. We can now say then there is a positive relationship between disposable income and consumption, meaning when disposable income increases, consumption increases. Okay? And also when disposable income increases, savings increases. Okay? So we can represent this in a graph. So what you see now is probably what we saw in this table. So what we see here is that there is, on the horizontal axis we measure the disposable income, on the vertical axis we measure consumption expenditures. 45 degrees line, the black one you see here, this is just a line that you see it halves this. So this is vertical line. So that means this is 90 degrees. So 45 degrees half this, which means every point on that 45 degrees line means that at this point, or on this line, the disposable income will equal consumption. So whatever you measure on the horizontal axis will equal whatever you measure on the vertical axis on that line. So that's why this line is very special, that 45 degrees line. And this is not the point here. The point is that when we look at this orange, or whatever this color is, this line, where you can see the points A, B, C, D, E. So this represents what we saw here in the table, between disposable income, the first column, and the second one, which is the consumption. So these exactly all the points. So what we can see here, A, B, C, you will see that consumption is above the disposable income. Remember, all points on that black line means that these two are equal. Consumption equal disposable income on this black line, or the 45 degrees line. So meaning that when you see consumption above this line, that means consumption is more than or exceed the disposable income. And that's what we saw here. For A, B, C, consumption will be or exceeds the disposable income. But at point D, both become the same, become equal. So for D here, so disposable income becomes is 6, and consumption expenditure is 6. And that is the point we see here, D. And as I said, that is the significance, or that's the importance of this 45 degrees line, because any point here on this line means that the disposable income equal consumption, and that is exactly what we see at point D. So at that point, consumption expenditure equal exactly disposable income. Beyond this, or after this point, which we have here 2 points, E and F, going back to our table, you will see that now disposable income is more or is greater than consumption. And here you'll see the 45 degrees line is above the consumption function, or this straight line. And also before point D, you will see that the savings are negative, or we're using our saving to finance that gap or that difference when consumption is above or exceed income. So we use savings to pay for this. Beyond that point, after point D, you will see that now we have positive savings, or now we can make savings here. So we'll see after point D, savings now become 0.5 and then 1. Okay? So as I said, this is just a graphical representation of the same example you saw now, which we call the consumption function. So that's the relationship between consumption and disposable income. Okay? So in the same, or in a similar way, we can show the saving function. So the saving function starts at negative point. So start here, -2. Why? So if I go back here, also minus 1.5, sorry. So if I go back here, at point A, disposable income was 0. As we said, consumption cannot be 0. And how we pay for this, how we finance this consumption while disposable income is 0, then we need to use our savings. We need to use savings. So savings in that economy will drop by 1.5, which is exactly the same point, or the same amount we need to cover this 1.5 consumption. And that's why you will see this start from negative point, and that's always the case. So it's going to start with negative point, and then so consumption starts with a positive point. Savings will start with the same point but at negative sign. And then point D, at that point, this is 0. So that means when disposable income equal to 0, savings, which we measure on the vertical axis, equal to 0. So because at that point we spend all our disposable income on consumption, and we save nothing. So we're not using our savings, but also we're not making any savings. Beyond this point, now we start making savings, and that's why you see this become positive. So E and F. So the main idea here again is the same. So when disposable income increases, savings increase too. So the main message here, again, so when disposable income increases, consumption increases. And that makes sense. If you think at individual level, if you think about yourself, then the same works for the whole economy or all households at the same time. So if their disposable income increased, then they spend more in consumption, and also they save more, so the savings will increase. So these are the two together. So these are not like nothing new in this graph. Just bring both together just to show you both functions together. And this will take us to a very important point. When your income increase, how much you're gonna spend on consumption? That is a very important point. I'll tell you why in a second. Let's say you spend, your income increased by £100. I know I'm talking about individuals now, but again, it's just the same for all households. So if your income increased by £100, how are you going to use this increase in your income? That's what we said. There are only two channels here. Yeah, there's no third option. So you're either going to spend in consumption or you save the £100. But you can spend some of this £100 in consumption and then save the rest. And that's what we're going to call, in economic term, we're going to call the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume is now, it's the percentage of the increase in your income that you're going to spend on consumption. So in my very simple and naive example with the £100 increase in your income, if you spend £80 on consumption, that means you've saved £20. And also that means that the tendency or your propensity to consume is 80% or 0.8, meaning that you spent 80% of the increase in your income on consumption. In economic terms, that's the marginal propensity to consume. And you can easily calculate this by dividing the change in consumption over the change in disposable income. So in my example, the change in consumption, remember, you spend £80 out of £100. So 80 is the change in consumption. Now your consumption increased by £80. The increase in your income was £100. So 80 divided by 100, that gives us 80% or 0.8. Okay? And that is, in economic terms now, that is the marginal propensity to consume. So in a very simple way to understand this, just always remember the £100 increase in your income and how much you're going to spend on consumption out of those £100. If, for example, you spend £70, that will make your marginal propensity to consume 70%. Okay? Because that's 70 out of 100. So it's 70% or 0.7. Okay? So I'll show you why it is important in a minute. So it's just mainly now, the main point now is to understand what it means. And then we'll see why, or the significance of this concept in economics, the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So let's now agree that the marginal propensity to consume, the formula is not a problem because anyone can apply this and can calculate how much the marginal propensity to consume. But what is more important is to understand what it means. And my example hopefully help you to do that, because always think of the £100 increase in your income and see how much you're going to spend out of this £100 increase in your consumption. That is the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So the marginal propensity to consume here is the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income. And it is the slope of the consumption function. So if you look back at that consumption function here, so the slope of this line, the orange one in the top section here, that's the consumption function, will tell you how much the marginal propensity to consume is. And this line could be represented in an equation like this. This is a linear equation. This is just an example. 1.5 plus 0.75 YD. So let's look at this very closely. Let's look at the equation now and let's see what we can say, what we can learn from this. If your disposable income is 0, so YD is 0. So 0 times 0.75, that's 0, yeah? So how much consumption will be? 1.5. That's the example we follow, yeah? Yeah? It says that. So that's what it means. So 1.5, which is always going to be like a constant here for the consumption function. Okay? So again, now we represent consumption function as a table like this, or we can represent it as a graph like this. This is this straight line here, the orange one. Or we can represent this as an equation like this. So that is the same example. As you can see, if YD equals 0, consumption will be 1.5. So that is to understand the significance of this 1.5, or the constant you'll see in the consumption function. This is the minimum level of consumption. Your consumption cannot go below that. And to be more specific now, we're talking about the macroeconomy, we're talking about all households. So the consumption in this economy cannot be below 1.5 even, you see, because that's the worst case. Your disposable income is 0. So there's no income. Income is 0 in this economy. And in that case, even though the consumption will be 1.5, okay? So that's how to understand this equation. What about 0.75? 0.75, we see in front of the YG, that is the slope of this function. That is the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income. And in the same time, that is the marginal propensity to consume. So in this example, marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. What does it mean? So if your income increased by £100, how much are you going to spend in consumption? Exactly, £75. Why? Because your marginal propensity to consume is 0.75 or 75%. Okay? So going back to the same example, giving that equation we have, the function we have, the consumption function we have, it means when your income increased by £100, your consumption will increase by £75, which is 75% of the increase in your income. Or if your income increased by £1, your consumption will increase by, what is the 75% of that £1? Exactly, 75p. That's it. That's what it means. Okay? So, as I said, what is more important than knowing how to calculate the marginal propensity to consume is to understand what it means. Okay? So always think of this £100 increase, and as I say, in your income, and this will and see how much you spend on consumption. Probably this will explain you what the marginal propensity to consume means. So in a very similar way, then, oh, this actually shows it on the graph. So this is the same example we're following, and in this example, you can calculate the slope of this function here, of this line here, between any 2 points. And because this is a straight line, the slope will be constant. So it doesn't matter which 2 points. So between D and E, for example, here, you will see that the change in consumption was 1.5, okay, between these two. And the change in disposable income between D and E, that was 2. So 1.5 divided by 2, that gives us 0.75. Excuse me. Okay? So that is again another way, because we agreed that the marginal propensity to consume is just the slope of that function. So that's another way to find out the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So in the similar way, we can think of savings, because going back to the same example, when your income is increased by £100, if you spend 80, that means you save 20. So if that means that your marginal propensity to consume is 80%, it must be, the marginal propensity to save must be 20%. So it would complement this. So this is because as I said, there's no third option. So your income goes between consumption and savings. So in that case, we can say then the marginal propensity to save in my example is 20%, given that you spend £80 of the increase in your income and you save £20. So that makes the marginal propensity to save 20%. Okay, and also, so that's how we would calculate the marginal propensity to save, is the change in savings divided by the change in disposable income. So in my example, the first example I gave, so it is 20, that's a change in saving, divided by 100. 100 is the change in your income, okay? And that gives us 20% or 0.2. In the same way, this is the slope of the saving function. So the slope of the saving function, we can find the slope of the saving function either by looking at this equation, if we have it in a linear equation like this. So this is going to be this coefficient in front of yd. So it's 0.25 in this example. Okay, 0.25 means what here? That is the marginal propensity to save. Going back to this example, how much was the marginal propensity to consume? Was 0.75. So if we go back to the same example, if your income increased by £100, then that means that you will spend £75 on consumption, you will save £25, and that is the 25% of the increase in your income, which is 0.25. Okay, so that is the slope of the saving function, which is 0.25. What about minus 1.5? This is when your disposable income equal to 0. So just replace yd by 0. 0 times 0.25, just 0. Then when your income is 0, when disposable income is 0 in any economy, then they need to finance their consumption, which was 1.5. That was the minimum level of consumption. And they will withdraw this, they will take this from their savings. So their savings will drop by 1.5. Okay, that is what it means. We could, in the same way, calculate this, the marginal propensity to consume, from the graph by just calculating the slope between any 2 points. As I said, because this is a straight line, so it doesn't matter which 2 points you're going to look at. So in this case, we're looking between G and E, and the change in savings was 0.5 this way, and the change in income was 2. So 0.5 divided by 2, that gives us 0.25. And that is the marginal propensity to save. And these are two together. Okay? So, before I go to this now, so let's just go back to what we're trying to do here. So the main idea. In the previous lecture, we look at both sides, the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. In this lecture, we're looking at the components of the aggregate demand. The first component was consumption. We want to understand what are the determinants of consumption and what determines the aggregate demand. So we would understand how the real GDP is determined in the very short run. Okay? So that's the whole story. What we looked at so far is that consumption is determined, or the most important factor that will determine consumption expenditure in any economy is disposable income, the after-tax income. So the income after we deduct the tax. So it's Y minus T. That's the disposable income. And also we know now that there's positive relationship between consumption and disposable income, meaning when your disposable income increases, your consumption increases. By how much? That depends on the marginal propensity to consume. That's why we're looking at what is this, the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? And again, so the marginal propensity to consume is very simple concept that is very important. So it's very simple because if you apply to a very naive example like the £100 increase in your income, just that's all what it means. Okay? So if your income increased by 100, giving this example, if your income increased by £100, following this example, this economy will spend over the increased consumption expenditure by £75, which is 75% of the £100, and that means they will save £25. Okay? And of course by now you should know that the sum of these together will equal 1. The sum of the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save equal 1. So if we sum 0.75 plus 0.25, that give us 1. Okay? Because there is no third option, as I said. So because your income either go to consumption or it goes between consumption and savings, then that's the 100% change in your income will go to these two together. So this is just, I'm trying to show why, or try to prove it, that they both will, the sum of these two will equal to 1, but you don't have to worry about that. So all what you need to know here is that the sum of the marginal propensity consumed plus marginal propensity saved equal to 1. That's the 100% of the increase. Remember, the £100, you spend £75 and you save £25. So the sum of these is 100% of the increase in your income. Okay? Okay, so that's the idea. So we looked at now the first component. That's the first component. Remember, what are the components we're looking at here? We're looking at 4 components. Or these components, the 4 components together, they compose the aggregate demand. And that's what we are interested in today, the aggregate demand and what determines the aggregate demand. Okay, so it's consumption. Now hopefully you understand what determines consumption is disposable income and how the relationship between these two works. And investment, so it's C plus I plus G, government expenditure, plus net exports, X minus M. So when P is fixed, and that's the assumption we made in the first slide today, when the price level is fixed, then the aggregate demand is determined by the aggregate expenditures, which is the consumption expenditure plus investment expenditure plus government expenditure plus net export. So it's the same equation. Okay, so what we look at here is the planned expenditure, what these sectors are planning to spend, which we call the aggregate planned expenditure. Okay, so what people, or what not just people, not just households, what all these sectors are planning to spend. So as I said, so nothing new here, is the same components we have. So that means is the sum of, so the aggregate planned expenditure is just the sum of the planned consumption expenditure plus planned investment plus planned G, which is government expenditure, plus X minus M. And as we said before, 2 of these components are influenced by the GDP. These 2 are C and M. Consumption and imports are influenced by the real GDP. Meaning when real GDP increase, that will increase consumption and planned consumption and the planned imports. But the other 3 components are not influenced by GDP. What are these 3 components? Investment, government expenditure, and export. So these are not influenced by real GDP. So we can represent the aggregate expenditure in a graph or on a table. So we can have this like a curve, like the way I'm gonna show you now. But before I show you this, just make sure that you now understand that what is the aggregate expenditure is just the relationship between the aggregate planned expenditure and real GDP. So let's see this. Remember, what are the components that are not influenced by GDP? 3. What are they? So investment, government expenditure, and exports. So in the graph you see now, we measure real GDP on the horizontal axis, and we have the aggregate planned expenditures on the vertical axis. Okay? And because what is the first component that does not or is not influenced by GDP, by real GDP, is investment. So you'll see investment as a straight line, the green one. Okay? It is horizontal line, the way you see it, because it's not affected by real GDP. So whatever real GDP is, 5, 10, 15, 20, that's the investment level. So it's not determined by GDP, by real GDP. That's why you see it, you see horizontal line. The same way with G. G is the government expenditure, and we say it is not influenced by real GDP, and it's again like a horizontal line. So what you see up here, the second line, the blue one, is the sum of I and G. So when we add G, then this the position of this horizontal line will just move upward, because now this is both together. So the blue line is not just G, it's I plus G. So when we add, so that means G is the difference between these two. So when we add X, so the third component that is not influenced by the GDP, this will give us I plus G plus X. So this orange one, the third line here, that is the sum of the three components that are not influenced by GDP. So then we want to add consumption. What about consumption? Consumption is influenced by the real GDP or income. We know that now consumption depends on income level. And the consumption function, if you remember, that's how it looks like. You see this curve, this line, the orange one? Okay, so there's a positive relationship. And that's why when we include consumption, okay, to this, you will see that top line here, not the red one, not this one, the top one, this is I plus G plus X, which we know now, plus C, and this is the same shape like the consumption function. When we add the last component here, which is M is minus M. So if you see it, it's X minus M. So it dragged this down a bit, so we have it, the aggregate expenditure, which is the red line here. So what is the red line here? This is how we represent the aggregate expenditure schedule or the aggregate expenditure curve. So this includes 4 components. What are they? Or all these components? C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So that is the representation of the aggregate expenditure. Okay, and again, remember, this is the relationship between this. Here we have real GDP on the horizontal axis and aggregate planned expenditure on the vertical axis. So that will take us to this distinction between the induced expenditure and the autonomous expenditure. So there are 2 components influenced by GDP, and these are the induced expenditures. So consumption and imports. So these are the induced expenditures. So we're looking at the same equation. Keep this in mind. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So C and M are influenced by GDP, and these 2 together, they are called the induced expenditure, and the other 3 are autonomous, which means they are not affected by the real GDP. That's why they are autonomous. Okay? So sorry. So the sum of investment, government expenditure, and exports, these are the autonomous expenditure. And they are not, or they do not vary with the GDP. Okay? So this is very important. So it's again, it's just following from this. So it's say the same thing. The only thing now we just know about the difference, or the economic terms, what we call them. So consumption and imports are influenced by the real GDP, and that's why they are induced expenditure. And investment, government expenditure, and export are not influenced by the real GDP, and that's why they are autonomous expenditures. Okay, so equilibrium, that's what we're looking forward to learn today, because that's the main point of the whole thing. So what we want to know is, as we said, last lecture we looked at both, at the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. This lecture we're focusing more on the aggregate demand and its components, because as I said, this model we look at the very short run, so, and we assume that prices are fixed, and given that the aggregate demand will determine the level of real GDP. So we want to know what level, or what is the equilibrium GDP. So at equilibrium, always the actual aggregate expenditure will equal real GDP. Our problem, or the main issue comes from the planned expenditure. Because the aggregate planned expenditure can equal or can be different from the actual aggregate expenditure, this will then show us where the equilibrium is. So we're looking at when the planned expenditure equal the actual one. So when what people plan, when what sold, sorry, not people, not just households, don't want you to understand to think that when I say people, I mean now, I mean just household, I mean all sectors. So when all sectors plan to spend, then that's what they plan. So is this the same as the actual, which is the real GDP? That is the main question. So when the aggregate planned expenditure equal real GDP, then this is the equilibrium point. Okay, so that is the equilibrium. And that's what you're gonna see here. I'll stop at this point.